And welcome everyone to the last session of Cochrane Thursdays in June. My name is Adrienne Stevens. I hope you're having a great day, and we are going to look at the second part of the snapshot of the steps of conducting a Cochrane review. I just want to acknowledge CIHR, who funds Cochrane Canada, as well as to PAHO, who provides Illuminate Live to us. And just as a reminder, once again, these are the items, the interactive buttons that you have available to you to use during the session, and you can easily add questions and comments into the chat room if you're not joining with a microphone. So, and once again, if you are joining by microphone, then we use one audio activated at a time. So when you're ready to ask your question, just click your raised hand button under the participant window, and this is the button you can use to select, ask your question, and then release at the end, and I can answer your question for you. And then just a reminder that if you notice an audio delay during the session, that doesn't improve within a few minutes, you can easily log out and log back in. But if you notice a brief interruption in the audio stream, don't worry, you'll get caught up. Illuminate keeps backup recordings during the session, and as I mentioned, you can add questions in the chat room throughout the session. So we're going to look at the final steps of conducting a Cochrane review, and then I'm just going to talk a little bit about publishing and co-publishing. Okay, and so we're back to this schematic that I used last week, and we're starting at the bottom looking at data collection and our critical appraisal. And so if I was to ask you, when we're looking at data collection, what is it that we're interested in collecting? So by now we've done our systematic search, we've pulled in relevant studies, we've screened them, we have our final inclusion pool. Now we want to look at those studies. So what type of information are we interested in collecting? You can just add your ideas into the chat room. So what kind of information are we wanting to pull? Okay, so someone says the PAHO components. Absolutely. So from each study we want to have a sense of the participant population, how the interventions and comparisons were defined, as well as the outcomes. So that's great. So we need to know the PAHO components from each study. And that's important because at the end of the day, this is a piece of work that you want actually used in policy and practice. And so the reader needs to be able to identify when they have a patient come into their office and say, okay, this patient is a question in essence, and we're trying to give them the answer to their question, that we're clear and transparent and detailed about what the individual studies are reporting on. Okay, so absolutely, it's PAHO. We also need to have source information about where it was published and what type of publication it was. We need to have information on the methods, and then obviously outcomes and results, and then any other miscellaneous information. So that's the information that we're pulling from these studies in a snapshot. And so when we're looking at data collection, I think the system is just a bit delayed. Okay, there we are. So when we're looking at data collection, again, just as for study selection, we have to determine a priori who is involved in the process and how to be able to minimize bias. And it's thinking through how are you going to handle disagreements, and then sort of going through that process and reporting information in your review. Also, developing a form is important. So, a lot of thought and planning needs to go into this. It's important to pilot it, to actually try it out on a few studies, to make sure that what it is that you're putting together will work, and to try to minimize the amount of at the end of the stage, the amount of disagreement. So trying to have something that's robust to work with. And then thinking through, is it something we're going to set up electronically? Who has access to what software or what program? Or is it something we're going to do on paper? And then, also thinking through, missing data, because as you go through, if this is something that you've not done before, that you can see the reporting is quite variable, and for the information you're specifically interested in, you may need to contact people. And so I think, you know, that item sort of underscores that there are quality of reporting issues out there, and that there's a difference between what was done and what was reported in a given article or paper or you know, report. And so, you know, if something wasn't reported, you cannot make the assumption that it wasn't done. And I think it's important to make that distinction between something that was not reported, something that was unclear, versus something that was, you know, very explicitly detailed. And so, you know, following up with authors, being clear about what you know and what you don't know is really important. And as an aside, given that this is such an important issue out there, you know, there's a whole group called the Cochrane Network, and what they've done is they've compiled all reporting guidelines and endorsed the development of reporting guidelines for studies, all different kinds of studies, not just intervention, for reviews, for different, you know, areas of research, etc. And so if you're familiar with CONSORT, that's a reporting guideline for randomized controlled trials. PRISMA is that for systematic reviews and meta-analyses, but it doesn't end there. There's a whole list. So I encourage you to check out equator-network.org and make sure that in your research that you're using those tools as well. So, you know, so we're looking at coming back to the PAHO. So this just gives you, and I'm just going to walk you through a couple of examples of, you know, when we're pulling information, well, just giving you a sense of, well, how much information or what is it that we're reporting. And so you can see on the screen, you know, there's information about, you know, in this particular example, you know, they're very clear and explicit about, you know, what was done for randomization, any loss to follow-up. So these items related to the methods of the study. So for participants, again, location, you know, defining the population in the study, the period, so the time stamp in which it was conducted, how they defined inclusion and exclusion criteria. And then when we move on to the interventions, so actually defining interventions, how many, you know, people in each group, and then the outcomes, how they were defined, and then any additional notes. And this is a great example where if information was provided through personal communication, for example, then that's something you want to be very clear and transparent about in your reporting. As I mentioned, when you're at the study selection stage and you're at that sort of full report selection, if you have to go through the process of you've pulled something and you realize, well, it doesn't meet my inclusion criteria, you need to be explicit in reporting that and providing why. And I like this example because they state sort of at which level of the PAHO or design that it doesn't meet. And so this is a means of transparency for the reader. Someone's reading and says, well, I'm aware of this study, how come they didn't include it? Then they can refer to this table, and if it's there, then they're made aware of why it was that it wasn't included. You may have some studies that are weighting assessment. So those are, you know, studies or trials that you don't have enough information on to be able to determine whether or not they meet your inclusion. And so what you can do is report what you know, and, you know, in the process follow with authors to try to find more information. And it might be that that you don't have enough information, let's say, to be able to make an assessment, and so you can just leave those there until more information is available. And then finally, ongoing trials. So if you know trials that are you know, in the works, in the process, then you can alert readers to, this is what I know is taking place, and I will incorporate this information when it becomes available. So that's sort of the characteristics of studies component. The second component is the methods, and actually thinking about the critical appraisal step. So if I was to ask you why you think it's important to critically assess a study, why would you think? What comes to mind? Why do you think it's important to assess the methods of a study? To minimize bias, for accuracy? Any other thoughts? Okay, so let's carry on, and it really, it all stems from this idea of bias. And so what you should be considering at the end of the day is believability, is trustworthiness, because you want to be able to have a sense of how confident are the results. And so you know, I think when the suggestion was made was looking at accuracy, I see that as, you know, let's see how much confidence, you know, can we place in the results. Is this truly reflective of what is occurring, or is there something else that's occurring that's actually obscuring the true effect? And so what is bias? In essence, it's systematic error. And the idea is if you were to repeat that same study with the way that they've designed it, their methods, repeating it multiple times, you would reach the same wrong answer on average. And this can lead to overestimating the treatment effect, or it can lead to us underestimating the true effect, and it can lead to large or small differences. And just to give you a sense, there are folks, as I mentioned, connected with the collaboration, that they look at the empirical evidence behind the methods, and one is the bias methods group, and one of the things that they've been able to sort of uncover, as outlined in the handbook, is that just looking at allocation concealment, and so what that is it's the method that you use to keep whatever randomized sequence that you've used intact without altering it. And so sort of one piece of empirical evidence that they pulled is that looking at a pooled analysis, so combining 7 methodology studies, showed that trials with inadequate allocation concealment were on average 18% more beneficial or more in favor of the treatment than studies who had adequate allocation concealment. And so you can see that this is an example where you're overestimating the treatment effect, and it's not a marginal one, it's not a small difference, it's an important difference. And so that's why it's important to sort of assess how much bias is occurring to again get that sense of confidence in the results. What it's not, so it's not imprecision. And so what I mean by this is basically your confidence interval. And so, if you have 2 studies and you see one has a larger confidence interval, it could be that it's a smaller study, which tends to occur with smaller studies. They have less information, therefore they're less precise in what they're able to tell you about what is occurring with the treatment effect. And so this is different from bias, because if you were to keep repeating the studies using larger sample sizes, then you get that better sense of the treatment effect with more information. And that's different from bias, because with an important bias that is at play, repeating those studies, it doesn't matter how large you make it, will not show you what the true effect is because of the way that they've designed the study. And I just want to make a bit of a distinction between bias and quality, in that there may be a study that's been conducted to the highest possible standards, and so might be considered a well-conducted study, but it doesn't mean that it's still free from bias. And so, there's an example, so for some interventions, like something that a physiotherapist would deliver, or a chiropractor, it's very difficult to blind investigators or blind the healthcare professional, because they know what they're delivering, and it's hard to blind the participant because they can tell what they're receiving. And so that's appropriate for the nature of that study, but that doesn't mean that it's not free from bias. It doesn't mean that the participants who receive that intervention, because they know they received that intervention, may still affect their outcomes, especially subjective ones if they're reporting on something like pain, or if they think that they've achieved an improvement. There are other markers where something would be shown to say, as this is done of high quality because of something like using consort guidelines. So just because they've reported the items that they've done doesn't mean that they're not free from bias in the way that they've conducted it. So just a bit of a distinction between those 2 items. And so, okay, so great, I understand, what this is conceptually, so then what do I do? What do I use to assess bias? And so there's been a lot of sort of careful thought put into this. And historically, there have been, a number of maybe scales out there that you're familiar with, something like the Haddad scale or other checklists where, they would assign points to particular items, and you would sort of add them all up and get a score, and people would use that score to determine whether or not something was of good methodological quality. But use of scales and sort of point-based values, it's not supported by the evidence, because it's difficult to justify the weights that are used for the scores. And historically, those scales were often based on whether something was reported rather than if it was done or done appropriately. And so again, it's that quality of reporting issue. And so what they're recommending now is the risk of bias tool. So as a Cochrane author, this is something that that you would use. And it was released, I guess, probably about 3 years ago. So it's been a few years that it's been incorporated. So it's not a scale or a checklist, but it's a domain-based evaluation. And what I mean by that is for each item in the tool, you describe what was reported, and you can add other items in there. So if you have other information sort of surrounding it, you're familiar with trials that this particular investigator has done in the past, or any other information, maybe you followed up with the author and they provided more information to you, then you would explicitly enter that into that field of the risk of bias tool, and then you make a judgment. And this is where you say, I think this is at low risk of bias or high risk of bias, or there's not enough information, or maybe they didn't report on that particular item, and so therefore it's unclear. And so that gives you a sense of what you are doing with the tool. And then once you have all of that information, you make summary assessments. And again, all of these items, so guidance on what's low, high, unclear risk of bias, that's all provided in the handbook. Guidance on how to make summary assessments, that's all provided in the handbook. And then you incorporate it into the analyses, and I'll get to that later. And so if we were to look at a quick schematic of a randomized trial, and so I just sort of pulled this together myself, and just as a teaching tool to walk you through some of the items of the risk of bias. So you have your pool of enrolled participants, you randomize them to your intervention or your control. They're followed forward, and then you gather information on outcomes. And so one item from the risk of bias tool is selection bias, and all that means it's differences between groups at baseline. And so something like randomization, so you look at randomization, whether that was done, as well as allocation concealment. The next item is performance bias, and so that's patients actually receiving care, or investigators or personnel actually delivering care. So seeing whether there are differences between the groups. Attrition bias, so this is withdrawal. So these are, either you have patients without data, or for some reason you haven't been able to follow them to get their information. So if they've moved away, for example. So that's another item of potential bias that you can look at in a study. And I'm sorry these are not appearing. They're not coming up as they look in my PowerPoint slide. And then detection bias, so that's actually detecting outcomes, so differences in how outcomes were determined in a given study. And then reporting bias. And so that's thinking about items like reported and unreported findings. So that's sort of if an investigator is being selective about the information that they're reporting in a given publication. So and it might be that it's, they're only reporting the results that are statistically significant, for example. So it's taking a look at whether sort of how they're reporting, whether there's a bias associated with that. And then there might be other biases you look at depending on circumstances and clinical settings. So this just gives you a bit of a snapshot. These are the items that you look at in a given study, and sort of how it relates to the process of conducting a trial. And there's more information and more guidance, of course, in the Cochrane Handbook, and but that's just sort of the snapshot look that I wanted to give you for today's webinar. Okay, are there any questions at this point? So hopefully that's given you a sense of what it is you're looking at when you're pulling information from studies and what you're looking at for the critical appraisal piece. Okay. So let's carry on. So next we're going to look at the analysis and presenting results. And so, so just as a quick overview, when you're looking at pulling together your data, it can either happen narratively. So what I mean by that is it's just sort of summarizing and providing the information in the text of your review, and you're not able to do any sort of quantitative analysis. So the quantitative is your statistical analysis, mainly meta-analysis. And so if you've heard the term meta-analysis, I can appreciate there are probably different knowledge levels joining us today, but just to briefly look at that, that's a statistical way of combining studies. So it could be 2 or more studies. And it's not necessarily appropriate in all circumstances. And so I think making this distinction, that you can't define a systematic review as high quality or as good based on whether or not it contains a meta-analysis. These are not synonymous. This is just a statistical way of pulling together information when it's appropriate, whereas this is much bigger. This is your whole process of synthesizing information. So I hope that distinction is helpful for you. And so if we were to look at sort of a big picture framework for looking at your synthesis, and this can be used whether you're doing a narrative or whether you're doing a quantitative analysis, but you need to look at, so when you're looking at your pool of studies, you need to look at, so collectively, what's the direction of the effect? Is it, you know, is your intervention or your treatment more effective than your control? And what's the size of the effect? So is it quite a large difference or is it a small difference? And then you need to look across studies. So is the effect consistent? So what, you know, if you were to look at all the studies, what story can you tell, or what story can be told when looking at across studies? And is it consistent so that you can tell a story? And then the final point is, what's the strength of the evidence? And so that item I will get to a little bit later. Why do you perform a meta-analysis? And so it can increase the statistical power. And so all I mean by that is if you are operating in an area where you have quite a few maybe smaller trials, and you know, due to the nature of smaller trials, it can be difficult to see whether there's a statistically significant effect because you may not have enough people in your study. Then what you can do is you can pull together all that information so that you're harnessing that information to increase your ability to see whether there's a difference or not, which in turn improves your precision, because the more information you have, the smaller those confidence intervals are, and so you get a better sense of what is going on because you have more information. To answer questions that are not able to be posed by individual studies, and so what I mean by that is, as you can appreciate, studies may vary slightly among them, and it might be that it still makes sense to pull them all together, but you can see as a result of that whether there's a consistency with a little bit of variation that's occurring. And you might be able to also settle controversies. So you're aware of, you know, sort of this publication that said, yes, this treatment is certainly beneficial, and you have another one that makes you, you know, reading through the results, you know, not so clear that it is. And so you can pull that information together to say, okay, is there a clear bottom line that I can make of this information? And as I alluded to earlier, it's not always appropriate to do a meta-analysis. And so thinking back to your PAHO, if you have studies that are clinically diverse in their patient populations, then it may not make sense to pull them all together. You may not have something that is really meaningful at the end of the day, because you might be comparing apples and oranges. As well, if there's a mix of comparisons, then maybe you just need to look at them separately and not look at all comparisons together. If your outcomes are too diverse, again, it might just muddy the waters by pulling them together. If there are serious issues with bias, because with bias with each study, that would be compounded in a meta-analysis, then those results might be misleading, and so it may not be appropriate to do a meta-analysis. And then if you know with your pool of evidence that there are issues with publication bias or any other reporting biases, then it may not make sense. And so, as you can appreciate, it's not a recipe. This is more guidance, and therefore it requires discussion and clinical or content judgment when you're determining the appropriateness of conducting a meta-analysis. So if we were to take a quick look at a narrative synthesis, so the guidance that the handbook provides simply states that if you're expecting this, then pre-specify how you're going to sort of walk people through or pull together the information, and so that's done in a systematic way to avoid bias. And I just provided an example where they've sort of gone through each study to narratively report on the results. So what you need to consider during the process of the analysis is that there are different types of data out there, and I'm not going to go into detail about this, but just being aware that some outcomes might be a yes-no. So it's called dichotomous or binary, where it's just a yes, it's occurred or not. It may be something like weight or height, where it's taken a value in a specific range, and so that would be called continuous data. Maybe it's categories that you're evaluating. So if you've walked into the ER because you've had an injury occur, and you've had your the intake person asking you, what's your pain on a scale from 1 to 10, then that would be something that would be an ordinal data set, or have some sort of natural order that you're responding on. Maybe there are counts, so these are items that could occur more than once in an individual, like side effects, or there could be time to event data where you're following people over time, where evaluating the time is an important part of the analysis, as well as actually recording the events. So that gives you a sense of the different types of data that you need to consider. And with each type of data, the analysis, and therefore sort of the effects measure or whatever statistic you're using, stems from that type of data. And I won't go into detail about sort of what the statistics that you would use for each of those. If you're interested in that, in Canada, we do what's called a standard author training, and it's a 2-day workshop that goes through in detail each of the components, and I'm walking you through, and that's where you would get more information and discussion on that. But this just gives you a sense of what you need to consider and outline. And so at the end of the day, when you've done your analysis, you need to have some sort of point estimate. So you've done your statistic, it comes up with a number. You need to have a confidence interval, so it's sort of the upper and lower end of where you're certain that the real effect lies, and you can include a p-value. I think it's important to note that having just the point estimate and the p-value is not informative, that you need to have the confidence interval, because it's much more meaningful and provides more information to the reader. And so this is just a slide that talks to you about uncertainty, talking about confidence interval for those of you who maybe haven't seen this in a while, or maybe it's new. So just in brief, you have more confidence with a data set with a narrower range than you have with a wider range. So a wider range says it could be anything within this range where the true effect lies, and it's much more uncertain. So I hope that makes sense and is a good explanation. So what I thought I'd do is I'd walk you through a forest plot. I can appreciate that some of you are probably already aware of forest plots, but for those of you who aren't, I just wanted to walk you through the components of one of these. So if you see them, then you know sort of what the components are. At the top, you'll have information on the review name. It outlines the comparison for that given analysis, as well as the outcome. And then you see these categories here. You have your study design, you have your intervention, your treatment, your statistic, the weight, and the actual sort of effect measure. And so I'm just going to go ahead. And so these are where all your studies are named. And these are the data for your intervention group. These are the data for your control group. And as you can see, it's the number of people experiencing that event over the total number. So it might be difficult for you to see here, but you'll certainly see it when I send you the slides. So you have that information for each. And this is an example of something that's dichotomous. So whether patients have experienced a stroke or not. Moving on, this is the statistic that you're using. So again, something like a risk ratio is something that you could use if you have that yes-no data set or dichotomous. And there are other ones for the other types. And the effects model, so all that means is that it can be fixed effects, it could be random effects, and so you're making assumptions about whether the underlying studies have a common effect or whether the underlying studies might be representing a range of effects. So that's just sort of a brief description. Again, you can visit that a bit more with the bit more in-depth training course. And this is the graphic representation of the results. This is visually, if you were to sort of have a visual of what each of the studies look like, then that's what that shows you. Down here, the scale is showing that this, when the data are on this side, so for each of these trials, each of these data points, when it's on this side, then you're saying that it's favoring the intervention for that outcome. Or you're seeing more of the outcome. That's sort of an odd way to say that because it's an adverse outcome, but you're seeing more of it occur in the intervention group. This side is for the control group, and if something crosses this middle line, then that's saying that there's no difference between the groups in the occurrence of that outcome. If you were to look at each individual study, so what you see is sort of this blue square, that's your point estimate for the statistic. That's the number that comes up for the statistic. And then the line is your confidence interval. And so those numbers correspond over here. So the blue would be 2.28, and then one end of the confidence interval would be 1.31, and then the other end would be 3.95. So that's where you're saying that you are 95% confident that the true effect lies somewhere in that range. And then weighting. So each of the studies is weighted based on the information that they provide, that they contribute to the overall analysis. And that's important because you don't just add all of these up, because what that does is it would treat it as if all of those studies were one study rather than accounting for the effect that they're different studies. So, you know, not all these studies, participants haven't been randomized, sort of against each other. That's not what's happened. So you weight them in the analysis so they contribute proportionately to the total. And moving on, so as I mentioned, these are the individual study sort of results, the statistics for each study. And then what you see down here, this bolded value, that's your final result. That's your numerical result for the meta-analysis, and then its graphical look correspondingly. So you can see that this is one where it crosses that middle line, and so that's saying that, that your intervention group is not statistically different from your control group, and what's occurring here in the graphic will, or the image will correspond to what's occurring here. If you're interested in wanting to know sort of for the different statistics, what's significant, what's not, how do I interpret, send me an email because I've put together a slide that outlines all of that, and I didn't include it here for purposes of time, but I'm happy to provide that to you. And then finally, so the previous slides, we were looking at something that was an adverse outcome. And so if we're looking at something that's a beneficial outcome, something like overall response, then you need to be cognizant that your data at the end of the day line up with how the studies were conducted. And so what I mean by that is you actually need to reverse your labels, because if you're looking for something like overall response and you see it occur more in your intervention group, then you'll have more data appearing on this side, and that's related to how you interpret these numbers. Again, I can provide you a slide that outlines all of that. Okay, so may I just pause here. Does that make sense to everyone? Does that sort of walk through of what a forest plot is, the information, sort of where to look for what and what it means? Does that make sense to you? I'm just looking for happy faces here, or you can send me a check mark or whatever. Okay, great. Okay, excellent. So moving on, so you've done your meta-analysis, but you can't stop there. One thing you need to look at is the variation. And so as I mentioned earlier, variation is something you look at before you actually undertake the meta-analysis. So you've looked at it at one level, but even when you think that everything is you know, sort of similar enough to combine, you may still end up with statistical heterogeneity. And so that's information that you pull from here. And I'll just move on to the next slide. And so heterogeneity, all it means is any kind of variation, any kind of variability that's occurring among studies. And so it could be clinical. So it could, maybe it's dealing with the disease severity of participants, maybe it's dealing with age, maybe it has to do with dose or intensity of the intervention, maybe how the outcomes were defined. So those would be examples of where there may be clinical variation. There may be methodological variation, and so that comes back to the method. So maybe there are items related to bias. Maybe it has to do with how they evaluated their data, that kind of thing. So there may be some methodological. So sorry, when I mean how they've evaluated their data, did they have all data on all participants? Did they have it only on those who just completed the treatment as they outlined it in their treatment protocols, for example? So there might be differences that way. And the third is statistical. And so when you look at statistical variation, it's really signaling you that there's something happening clinically, methodologically, or perhaps both. And there are ways at you know, sort of quantifying this. I'm not going to get into detail on this. Again, you can get more in-depth training on that with the 2-day course, but there are ways to look at that and to interpret that, and it stems back to the information that's here. And it's important when you're thinking ahead, so if you're way back at the protocol stage, you're thinking ahead to what might be happening, it's important for you to you know, identify what you think sort of items they might look at that might cause heterogeneity, so that you can identify them in advance before you're looking at the data, and then actually investigate them as needed afterwards. And so there's a distinction between what you've defined in advance versus what we call post hoc, or what you've identified after the process. And so you know, especially with the post hoc, because it's at a point where you already looked at the data, you don't want to put so much reliance on that type of information, but might lead to hypotheses that you can test then in other studies. And so it's important to look at heterogeneity because it's an important factor when you're determining your confidence in the findings. If there's so much variation that's being detected, then you're not as confident to say, well, you know, whatever the result is at the end of the day would actually occur if I was to start using this treatment, or would occur among my patient population. So that's why it's important to take a look at it. One thing that people might do, and I just point this out in the event that you come across this, they might do a subgroup analysis. So they might have determined in advance maybe they want to look at something based on dose or based on baseline characteristics, and so they could do subgroup analyses. So they just pull together the studies that relate to however they've defined their subgroups. And I haven't shown you the full picture here just because of space, and I wanted for it to be somewhat legible when you look at it. But then you can get sort of subgroup results, and the subgroup for this set would be sort of down here. So subgroup is something that people might undertake. Another thing that researchers might undertake is what's called a sensitivity analysis, and that's when you remove studies from your analysis due to items that you know, you might want to investigate to determine whether what your findings are with the analysis are still robust. So if it's you know, something like you just want to restrict to studies at low risk of bias to see whether, you know, the ones that were unclear or high actually changed the result, then that's something you can do, and it gives you a sense that even if you look at just the low risk of bias and there's no change overall, no important change in your estimate of the effect, then you can have some sort of confidence that, you know, regardless of those sort of differences in you know, in bias or how they conducted their study, that, you know, this is still a result that we could expect to occur in our patient population. So that just gives you sort of two items that you may come across when you're reading reviews that they've done to explore heterogeneity. So I'm ready to take questions, and there were a couple that were added into the room, so I can answer them for you. For the listing of excluded articles, what if there are a very large amount, such as 2,000? Would you need to collect all the data and list all the excluded articles? I doubt that once you've actually conducted your search and you've gone through, so you have your pool of studies, and it might just be an abstract. When you do that initial screening, you can just exclude ones that are quite obviously not relevant. So in that pool, you might get 2,000. But when you're at the full text stage, you're going to have a list or a grouping of trials that are more than likely going to meet your inclusion criteria, and you might have a subset of those that don't. So in that group, you probably wouldn't have 2,000. And so you might have, you might have 20 or 30 or that kind of thing. It depends on how much information or how many studies you have related back to your question. So if you have a broad question, you might do your search, you might have 10,000, let's say, citations to screen, and you can get rid of a lot of those and then end up with a smaller pool. So you might have more excluded studies there versus a review where you only pull together 200 citations because there isn't as much information out there. So it's not likely that in your table of excluded studies you would have 2,000 because you've taken that initial step to screen out ones that are clearly not relevant. The second question, is the odd ratio or risk ratio the same? No, they're two different statistics, and it's important you brought that up because sometimes the odd ratio can be interpreted as though it's a risk ratio. Again, this is a question that is sort of beyond the scope of this webinar, but if you want more information, please feel free to follow up with me, and I can provide you more information with that. But no, they're not the same, and it's important when someone is using either of those, that they word their interpretation and word the results appropriate to the statistic so that a reader doesn't confuse the interpretation of a risk ratio versus an odds ratio. Okay, if there are no more questions, then I will move on. And I hope those answers were clear for you. So let's look at the next steps of conducting a review, and that's your interpretation of the results. Okay, so one of the items that is relatively new, again, just within the last few years, is the use of GRADE. And so GRADE is an acronym for Grading of Recommendations, Assessment, Development, and Evaluation. And so GRADE was developed for clinical practice guidelines originally to be able to pull together and synthesize the information, and now it's used within Cochrane reviews. And so the idea here is you're determining the extent to which you're confident that the estimate of effect is correct. And you look at a number of factors for this. Again, I'm not going to go into detail, but to give you an example, RCTs generally start at that high level. And so what can happen is if there are serious issues of bias, if there's unexplained heterogeneity or inconsistency of the results, those are just two examples of factors, then you would downgrade because of those items, and you're less certain that your estimate effect is really truly what is going on. And therefore, when it's something like very low, then what you're saying is any estimate of the effect is uncertain. And therefore, if you add more information, as we get more studies, more well-done studies added into the equation, then it's quite likely to change the actual estimate of effect. And so it's a very nice, transparent way to walk people through, these are the factors that might be affecting this data, and this is the confidence level you should have in the information. So it's actually quite nice. And just for matter of reference, it's something that you assess at the outcome level. And so I'm just going to just forward ahead to the next slide. And so this is an example of a summary of findings table. And so you use the GRADE assessment to create one of these. And so again, you have your PAHO defined at the top, and then you do an assessment at the outcome level. So for this review with spinal manipulative therapy compared to some sort of inert intervention. So it's something that it's a sham. It's not really, it's something that was done but not actually meant to be effective for chronic low back pain. And so when you're assessing pain, and so they've provided you with the scale, how it's sort of the direction, how it's interpreted, and the follow-up time. So for that outcome, then they can tell you, okay, this is the information, this is what you could expect to happen in your control population. This is what it could happen out there without the intervention. This is what we're seeing among the pool of studies is occurring when when participants receive that intervention. Then you can provide some sort of estimate of relative effect, and so for pain, because it's not a dichotomous outcome, then you won't have a relative effect, and so as a result, they've added their data here. But you can tell how much information they were able to base it on. And so in this case, it's only one study with 72 participants. And as a result, when they went through the items that can downgrade this particular, among the trials for this outcome, they were able to say at the end of the day, it's very low. So any estimate is uncertain. They're uncertain, is this really what's happening when you add that intervention? And so this is a nice way to very transparently and clearly outline your data and what kind of confidence you can put in the results. So going through the summary of findings, going through the grade, that sets the stage for your discussion. And so here, you're at the point where now you've synthesized all your data, you know all of the information, you've gone through, you've presented it. Now you discuss, you interpret your findings, you provide context for them and any complementary considerations. And I quite like the way that Cochrane has outlined this. So you provide your summary, your summary of main findings. So this is where you do the trade-off of benefit and harms. You explicitly refer to your summary of findings table here. Then you look at the overall completeness and applicability. So this is external validity. So, this is where you take the look at, well, have all your relevant types of participants, interventions, outcomes been investigated? You can comment on the results, how the results of the review can fit in context of practice. You need to keep sort of the international variations in practice in mind when you do that, but that's certainly something that you can address. Then you outline your quality of evidence. So here you summarize the amount of evidence, you state your key methodological limitations, you can reiterate the consistency or inconsistency. So at the end of the day, people should get a good sense of the overall quality of evidence that you're working with. You should be clear about any potential biases in the review process. Maybe you question whether or not you've obtained all relevant studies, or maybe you don't think you have all of the relevant data, and anything else that you think might be biasing your pull together of all of this. And then another section where you can outline disagreements or agreements with other studies or reviews that are out there. And it's important for you to clearly indicate whether those findings are from traditional narrative reviews or whether they're from systematic reviews. So that gives you a sense. I quite like this when they were explicit with this in one of the newer versions of the handbook, in that you can clearly walk people through the information and provide what they need to be able to interpret. And so from that, it sets the stage for your conclusions. And so there are two sections in the conclusions. One is implications for practice. Again, everything comes back to PAHO, comes back to, and in this section you will focus mainly on your primary outcomes. But I just want to underscore that it's not making recommendations. These are not clinical practice guidelines, but what you are simply doing here is, providing the evidence. And then the second section is just implications for research. And so this is where you can, if you've identified gaps or you realize that there are important things for your future research to focus on, then this is where you outline it. And I and they've provided this what's called epicot structured format. And so all that is you can outline sort of what the current evidence is. You can outline sort of, for future research, items related to the population that should be investigated, your interventions, your comparison, your outcomes is the O. So, what clinical or patient-related outcomes will the researcher need to measure, improve, influence, or accomplish, what methods of measurement should be used, and then the timestamp. And this is important to be able to say, this is what we have identified as of this date, and it could be the date of the literature search that you've conducted for the review, or even just the writing date of the review. Are there any questions at this point? I hope that gives you a good sense of how you sort of, especially the latter stages, giving you that confidence or that sense of these are the items I can address and being clear with those. I see that there's a couple of questions coming through, so I'll just wait a moment. I will definitely send the slides after the presentation. What I will do is, if you need to leave right away, we can send them by email to everyone, but I certainly send them through the interface so you can see it. You didn't get the full meaning of epicot, and what I will do is I will include that when I send the items out. So yeah, what the acronym stands for and the items you can look at. How about if I add that into the email when we send the slides? And I know there were a couple of questions still from last week that I haven't gotten back to you about, and I can do that as well. Can you please touch on observational studies on which different predictor variables but common outcome factor? I'm not sure that I know what you mean by that. There are different items you need to look at for bias, certainly with observational studies, and you can still use the risk of bias tool to do that. You can add new fields, sort of other fields into the risk of bias tool to address those, certainly. And then those, again, should factor through biological and social factors associated with heart disease. Do you know what? I think maybe that's probably, if you want to have a one-on-one conversation, why don't we take that offline? It's probably a very specific question than what I'm going to cover for the webinar. So we can certainly address that on the side. Okay. But thank you for the question, and certainly follow up with me and we can discuss it. So finally, let's look at that structured report. So, you've finished everything, you've done your conclusions, and then you need to come back and create your abstract. And so the idea behind the abstract, for those of you who are familiar with this, it's probably quite obvious, but for those of you who aren't, the idea is meant to stand alone. It's concise, but includes the most important content. And it's important to note that you're not to link to other parts of the review. This is meant to be standalone, but gives you that final important synopsis of what had taken place, what occurred in the review, and what the outcomes were. They were limited to just 400 words. They've now been expanded, so you're encouraged to have your abstract somewhere around the 700-word mark. So yes, you summarize your key methods, results, and conclusions. And only the most important comparisons and outcomes should be summarized, not selectively those with the most significant results. And we also produce a plain language summary as well. And the idea behind this is anyone, even without a subscription to the Cochrane Library, can access the abstract and plain language summary. And so this is meant for, this is the non-academic version of the abstract. It's meant for consumers of healthcare. Again, it's meant to be standalone. You can write the first draft as an author, but certainly your review group will help you to make sure that it is in plain language summary format. And there's also other folks within the collaboration who contribute their time to help write these and make sure that they're a sound summary. And there's more information in the handbook that provides guidance for this. So, and then finally updating. And so I sort of structured this this wheel such that, when you're doing this review for the first time, you start at the research question, you make your way through all of the items, and you end up with your structure report. And then what you do at the update is you sort of every 2 years thereabouts, you keep revisiting these. So, you refresh yourself on the question, the eligibility criteria, you redo the search, you redo your study selection, and then you sort of integrate all the information. And so this part is iterative. So as mentioned in previous webinars, the updating, it's an important part. We need to keep the evidence up to date on the Cochrane Library. People pull information from the Cochrane Library to use in their context, so you need to make sure that it's not out of date. And so the current recommendation is within 2 years, but it certainly could be sooner than that if you're working in an area where there's a lot of new publications. So updating is an important part of the review. Finally, publishing and co-publishing. And so, of course, at the outset, when you're signing on to do this review with Cochrane, you are committing to publishing it within the Cochrane database of systematic reviews. Co-publication is possible. It's something that you need to make your review group aware of as soon as you have interest in doing this. It would be an abridged version, but it's certainly work that needs to be coordinated. It can't just be an afterthought, oh, maybe I should also publish in this journal and just go ahead. It's something that the publisher of that second journal has to be aware that they're entering a co-publishing agreement with Wiley to do this, that all of the information is coordinated by your review group, etc. And it could be that if you do this and you receive feedback, that at an update phase you might be able to incorporate some of that feedback in your review. So it is possible, but it should be something where you're wanting to reach a specialist audience because of the nature of your review, or you want to publish it in a journal other than English. So those are just a couple examples of why you might co-publish. But as I mentioned in session 2, the Cochrane Library, or the Cochrane Database of Systematic Reviews has an impact factor on its own. Okay. So are there any other questions? We're at the end of our session now, so I hope that through this series you've gained an appreciation of Cochrane, understanding what are systematic reviews, their importance, how to search and make value and use of the Cochrane Library, and then getting that snapshot of view about what it is and how it is that we actually conduct a review. Okay, well, if there are no other questions, thank you for joining. I just add this slide. There have been a number of folks, a number of my colleagues within Cochrane Canada and elsewhere who've contributed to the slides that I've used today or used in other presentations, and so I just want to acknowledge them. I'm going to send you an evaluation form, so please don't leave. If you have a few minutes, I'm going to send it through the interface, and I would appreciate your feedback on this series. Ways to improve, I'm open, and any other ideas for topics, I would be grateful to receive. This is our website here, so feel free to visit it if you wish to learn more about what we do here at Cochrane Canada, as the Canadian Cochrane Centre does in particular. And this is the email you can send the evaluation form to, and it's also provided on the form. So thank you once again, and have a great day.